November 1st,
Pacific. American Marines were preparing.
1943.
Planes and shore installations were shot up with methodical regularity.
American Marines stormed the beaches of Bougainville expecting another bloody island fight.
Since the attack on Guadalcanal was underway. Every ship in the area.
The intelligence reports say 35,000 Japanese troops are waiting for them.
They encountered an enemy ambush at Coconut Grove. The Marines attacked all along the line.
The generals predict weeks of brutal combat. They're wrong about the timeline. What happens instead is a 9-month nightmare where the jungle kills more men than bullets ever could, where Japanese soldiers starve to death in their foxholes, where an entire army disintegrates not from American firepower, but from disease, hunger, and the slow, grinding brutality of tropical warfare. By the time Australian forces officially end the campaign in August 1944, 18,000 Japanese soldiers are dead. Most never fired a shot at the enemy. Most died slowly, forgotten by their own command, abandoned in a jungle that devoured them whole. This is the story of Bougainville, the Pacific War's longest and strangest battle. And it starts with a decision that would doom 35,000 men to hell on earth. Bougainville is massive, not like the tiny coral atolls that defined most Pacific battles. This island is 125 miles long and 30 miles wide. Dense jungle covers 90% of it. Mountains rise up to 10,000 feet. Swamps stretch for miles. Rivers cut through impenetrable rainforest. If you wanted to design an island specifically to kill soldiers, you'd design Bougainville. In 1943, Japan controlled the entire island, and they'd turned it into a critical link in their defensive perimeter. 4 airfields, a major seaplane base, naval anchorage, supply depots. Bougainville sat at the northern end of the Solomon Islands chain, and whoever controlled it controlled the skies over the entire region. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood this. That's why he positioned 35,000 troops on Bougainville, split between Imperial Japanese Army and Navy forces. But here's the problem. Those 35,000 men weren't concentrated. They were spread across that massive island in clusters. The main airfields were in the south at Kahili and Kara. A separate force of 5,000 men held Buka Island to the north. Another 15,000 were scattered in the central jungle. The remaining forces defended the various coastal positions. This dispersion made sense for defending multiple airfields, but it would prove catastrophic when the Americans arrived. Because the Americans weren't coming for the airfields. They were coming for one small, miserable piece of coastline that nobody thought mattered. The Japanese expected an assault on the southern airfields. They'd fortified them heavily. Bunkers, artillery positions, underground shelters. They were ready for a massive amphibious assault that would rival Tarawa or Guadalcanal. Instead, on November 1st, 1943, 14,000 Marines landed at Cape Torokina on the island's western coast. A place the Japanese had barely defended because it seemed worthless. Swamps, jungle, no infrastructure, no strategic value. The initial landing met almost no resistance. A few hundred Japanese defenders tried to stop 14,000 Marines. It was a massacre. Within hours, the beachhead was secured. Within days, American engineers were clearing jungle and building their own airfields. The Japanese command was stunned. Why land at the worst possible location on the entire island? The answer was brilliant and cruel. America didn't need to conquer Bougainville. They just needed to build airfields close enough to bomb Rabaul, Japan's massive fortress 200 miles northwest. The rest of the island could rot. This decision sealed the fate of 35,000 Japanese soldiers. They weren't going to be invaded and destroyed quickly. They were going to be isolated and left to die slowly. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake commanded the Japanese 17th Army from Rabaul. When he learned about the Cape Torokina landing, he faced an impossible choice. He had 35,000 men on Bougainville, but they were in the wrong positions. The bulk of his forces were 50 to 100 miles away from the American beachhead, separated by some of the worst terrain on Earth. Moving troops across Bougainville wasn't like moving them across a normal island. There were no roads. The jungle was so thick, you couldn't see 20 feet ahead. The mountains were near vertical slopes covered in mud. Rivers ran fast and deep. And every step of the way, malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery waited to strike down any man who drank the wrong water or got bitten by the wrong mosquito. But Hyakutake had no choice. He couldn't let the Americans build airfields unopposed. So he ordered his scattered forces to converge on Cape Torokina. It took them 6 weeks just to get into position. Think about that. 6 weeks of marching through hell. Japanese soldiers carrying full combat loads, artillery pieces, mortars, ammunition, supplies. No resupply possible. Everything they needed had to be carried on their backs or dragged through the jungle. Men started dying before they ever saw an American. Heat exhaustion, infected cuts, tropical ulcers that ate through flesh down to the bone. Soldiers who fell behind were left because the column couldn't stop. The jungle swallowed them. By mid-December 1943, Hyakutake had assembled about 8,000 troops in the hills overlooking the American perimeter. They were exhausted, half-starved, and sick. But they were going to attack anyway because Japanese doctrine left no alternative. The attack came in waves starting December 30th. Japanese forces hit the marine perimeter from multiple directions. Artillery pounded American positions. Infantry charged through the jungle. For 3 weeks, the fighting was intense and brutal. But the Americans had advantages the Japanese couldn't overcome. Air support, naval gunfire, artillery that could fire tens of thousands of shells per day. And most importantly, supply. American logistics could replace every bullet fired, every bandage used, every ration consumed. The Japanese couldn't replace anything. By late January 1944, the Japanese counterattack had failed. They'd suffered 3,000 casualties. The Americans had held their perimeter and expanded it. More critically, American airfields were now operational. Fighters and bombers were flying missions against Rabaul every day. The battle for Cape Torokina was over. But the nightmare for the Japanese garrison was just beginning. Because now they had to decide, what do 32,000 sick, starving, isolated soldiers do when they've already lost? By February 1944, the strategic situation was clear to everyone except the Japanese soldiers on Bougainville. The island no longer mattered. American airfields were operational. Rabaul was being pounded into rubble. The entire Solomon Islands campaign was winding down as American forces moved further north. The Marines who'd landed at Cape Torokina began rotating out, replaced by Army divisions, not because the island was in danger, but because those Marines were needed elsewhere. The Army's job was simple: hold the perimeter, expand it slowly, and make sure the Japanese couldn't interfere with the airfields. For the Japanese, the situation was catastrophic. They controlled 90% of Bougainville's land area, but had lost the only part that mattered. And now they were trapped. American submarines and aircraft controlled the waters around the island. No supplies were coming, no reinforcements, no evacuation. 35,000 men were on their own. General Hyakutake tried to organize his scattered forces. He established headquarters in the Central Mountains. Radio communication with the various units was spotty at best. Many positions were completely cut off. But Hyakutake issued orders: dig in, fortify positions, prepare for a long defense. What he couldn't order into existence was food. Bougainville's jungle wasn't like the Philippine lowlands where rice grew and villages could be raided. This was primary rainforest, dense, hostile, and nearly devoid of edible plants. The Japanese had some supplies stockpiled at their various bases, but not nearly enough for 35,000 men for an extended period. They tried to grow crops, small garden plots carved out of the jungle. But tropical soil is poor. Crops grew slowly, if at all, and the constant rain caused rot and mold. A sweet potato that took months to grow could become inedible overnight. They tried to fish. Coastal units had some success, but most of the garrison was inland, miles from the ocean. And American aircraft shot at anything moving on the water during daylight. They tried to hunt, but Bougainville's wildlife was sparse. Wild pigs existed, but were nearly impossible to track in the dense jungle. Birds were too small to feed an army. The jungle had plenty of life, but almost none of it was edible to humans. By March 1944, rations had been cut to 600 calories per day, about a quarter of what a soldier needs. Men were getting weaker. Disease spread faster because malnourished bodies couldn't fight infection. And the Americans weren't even trying to destroy them. That was the cruelest part. The U.S. strategy was containment, not annihilation. American patrols would probe Japanese positions, call in artillery if they encountered resistance, then pull back. They weren't trying to conquer the jungle. They were just making sure the Japanese stayed in it. For the Japanese soldiers, every day became a test of survival. Wake up weak from hunger. Check if the man next to you died during the night. Eat a handful of rice if any was available. Sit in a flooded foxhole because the rain never stops. Fight off the mosquitoes. Try not to scratch the infected wounds. Hope the fever passes. Try to sleep despite the hunger cramps. Repeat tomorrow. This wasn't war. This was slow death. By May 1944, the Japanese garrison had been isolated for 6 months. The death toll was accelerating, but not from combat. Disease and starvation were killing 50 to 100 men per day across the scattered positions. Malaria was endemic. Every soldier on the island had it to some degree. The fever would spike, leaving men delirious for days. Then it would recede, only to return weeks later. Quinine supplies had run out months ago. Men just had to endure the cycles of fever, chills, and hallucinations. Dysentery was worse. Constant diarrhea meant soldiers couldn't retain what little nutrition they were getting. Men wasted away, too weak to move, lying in their own filth because they couldn't even crawl to a latrine. The smell of death hung over every position. Tropical ulcers were horrifying. A small cut or insect bite would become infected. Without antibiotics, the infection would spread. The flesh would rot. You could see bone through the wounds. Some men had ulcers that consumed entire limbs. Amputation was common, done with whatever tools were available, often without anesthesia because medical supplies were gone. Beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiency, made men's legs swell to grotesque sizes. They couldn't walk, couldn't stand, just sat and waited to die. The Japanese military medical system had completely collapsed. Field hospitals existed, but they had no medicine, no bandages, no food for the sick. Doctors could do nothing but watch their patients die. Some hospitals became death houses, where 6 soldiers were sent simply to die out of sight of the combat troops. Unit cohesion began to break down. Soldiers stopped following orders. What was the point? Officers couldn't threaten men who were already dying. Court-martial meant nothing when execution would be a mercy compared to slow starvation. Some units turned on each other. Accusations of food theft led to beatings and killings. Men who found food hid it from their own comrades. The bonds of military discipline and brotherhood dissolved under the pressure of starvation. Desertion became common, though there was nowhere to desert to. Men would simply wander off into the jungle, either hoping to find food or just wanting to die alone, rather than among the dying. Search parties weren't sent because there were no resources to waste on retrieving deserters who'd probably already died anyway. Suicide increased. Officers who'd lost their entire commands. Soldiers who couldn't bear another day of suffering. The sound of a single gunshot in the night became routine. Nobody investigated. One less mouth to feed. And through it all, American patrols would probe the perimeter, call in artillery strikes on any Japanese position that fired back, then withdraw. They weren't trying to kill the Japanese. They were just keeping them contained while nature did the work. Japanese commanders sent increasingly desperate messages to Rabaul. They needed food, medicine. Ammunition didn't matter anymore because they were too weak to fight. Just send food. Please send food. Rabaul had nothing to send. The fortress itself was under siege, being bombed daily by aircraft flying from Cape Torokina's airfields. The submarines and transport ships that might have carried supplies to Bougainville had been sunk or were needed elsewhere. The Japanese couldn't save their garrison even if they wanted to. In June 1944, General Hyakutake sent a final message to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo. He reported that his 17th Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The men were dying by the hundreds. There was nothing he could do to stop it. He requested permission to evacuate the island or permission for his men to conduct a final banzai charge to die with honor. Tokyo's response was simple: hold your positions. The Emperor expects you to do your duty. That duty, it turned out, was to die slowly in the jungle while accomplishing nothing. In October 1944, American forces handed control of Bougainville to Australian troops. The Americans were needed for the Philippines invasion. The Australians would handle mopping up operations. When Australian commanders assessed the situation, they were shocked. The Japanese weren't a military threat anymore. They were starving refugees scattered across the jungle. Aerial reconnaissance showed abandoned positions, no movement, no signs of organized defense. But orders were orders. The Japanese garrison still existed and needed to be neutralized. So the Australians launched offensive operations to compress the Japanese into smaller and smaller pockets. This changed everything for the dying Japanese soldiers. The Americans had been content to contain them. The Australians actively hunted them. Australian patrols pushed deep into the jungle, engaging Japanese positions and calling in artillery. They weren't trying to kill every Japanese soldier, but they were trying to destroy the organized units that still existed: command posts, supply depots, radio stations, anything that allowed the Japanese to function as a military force. For the Japanese, this was almost a mercy. Many soldiers welcomed combat. Better to die fighting than waste away from disease. When Australian patrols encountered Japanese positions, the defenders would often launch desperate counterattacks, seeking death in battle rather than slow starvation. But most Japanese soldiers never saw combat. They died in their foxholes, in makeshift hospitals, along jungle trails. The Australians found thousands of bodies in various stages of decomposition. Entire campsites full of skeletons. Hospitals where every patient had died and been left unburied because the living were too weak to dig graves. One Australian patrol discovered a Japanese field hospital with 200 dead soldiers. They'd been dead for weeks. The medical staff had died trying to care for them. Bodies were stacked in crude shelters, personal effects scattered everywhere, letters from home that would never be answered. Another patrol found a supply depot that contained nothing but empty rice bags and the bodies of the soldiers who'd guarded it. They'd eaten everything, then died once the food ran out. The few Japanese soldiers who survived were almost impossible to recognize as human beings. Walk-in skeletons, skin stretched over bones, eyes sunken into skulls, covered in sores and ulcers. Many couldn't speak. Some couldn't walk. When captured, they didn't resist. They couldn't. Australian medics tried to help the prisoners, but many were too far gone. Even with food and medicine, their bodies couldn't recover. Organs had shut down, immune systems destroyed. They died in captivity, their bodies finally giving up after months of suffering. Through late 1944 and into 1945, the Australians continued their offensive, not because the Japanese were a threat, but because command wanted the campaign concluded. Villages were cleared, pockets of resistance eliminated. Mountains searched for holdouts. The Japanese kept dying, not in glorious battles, but in quiet groups as starvation and disease finished what American isolation had started. August 21st, 1945. 6 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Australian forces on Bougainville finally stopped offensive operations. The campaign was over. Time to count the cost. The numbers were staggering and depressing. Of the 35,000 Japanese soldiers on Bougainville when the Americans landed in November 1943, approximately 18,000 were dead. 9,000 more were so sick or malnourished they died within weeks of surrender. Only 8,000 were recovered alive, in condition to survive. And here's the truly horrifying part. Fewer than 3,000 of those 18,000 deaths were from combat. The rest died from disease, starvation, and exposure. The jungle killed them. Their own command killed them by abandoning them. The American strategy of isolation killed them. For the Americans and Australians, casualties were remarkably light given the 9-month campaign. About 1,200 dead from all causes. The kill ratio was absurdly one-sided, not because of superior tactics or firepower, but because the Japanese garrison essentially committed slow collective suicide. American losses in taking and holding Cape Torokina, about 700 dead. Japanese losses trying to retake it, 3,000 dead in combat, 15,000 more from starvation and disease in the months after the failed counterattack. It wasn't a battle. It was a siege where the besieged army was trapped not by enemy lines, but by geography, logistics, and their own command's inability to evacuate or resupply them. General Hyakutake survived. He surrendered to Australian forces in August 1945. When asked about the campaign, he reportedly said that Bougainville wasn't lost in combat. It was lost the moment Imperial headquarters decided the island was expendable, but didn't evacuate the garrison. His 17th Army had been written off, left to die, and die they did, slowly and pointlessly, while accomplishing nothing except proving that determined men can suffer for months before their bodies finally give out. The Japanese soldiers who died on Bougainville didn't die storming machine gun nests or holding impossible positions against overwhelming odds. They died in foxholes, shitting themselves to death from dysentery. They died in field hospitals with no medicine. They died along jungle trails, too weak to walk another step. They died quietly, forgotten by their own command, while the war moved on without them. Bougainville teaches a brutal lesson about Pacific War strategy. The Americans learned early that you didn't need to conquer every island. You just needed to control enough of it to build airfields and cut off the enemy. Then you let isolation, disease, and starvation do the rest. This strategy saved American lives. Instead of fighting 35,000 Japanese troops in jungle combat that could have cost 10,000 American casualties, the U.S. lost about 700 men. From a purely military perspective, it was brilliant. But it created a different kind of horror. A slow-motion massacre where men died not quickly in combat, but slowly over 9 months. Where disease and hunger killed more than bullets ever could. Where an entire army disintegrated not from military defeat, but from abandonment. Today, Bougainville is an autonomous region preparing for independence. The jungle has reclaimed most of the battle sites, but occasionally, villagers still find remains. A skeleton in a collapsed foxhole, bones scattered along an old trail, dog tags in the undergrowth, reminders that 18,000 men died in that jungle, most of them alone, most of them forgotten. The Battle of Bougainville lasted 9 months, but for the Japanese soldiers trapped there, every single day was its own eternity of suffering. And unlike battles that end in hours or days, this one gave men time to understand exactly what was happening to them. Time to realize they'd been abandoned. Time to feel their bodies breaking down. Time to know they were going to die slowly while accomplishing nothing. That's why Bougainville lasted 9 months, because the Americans didn't need to destroy the Japanese garrison quickly. They just needed to contain it and wait for nature to do the killing. 18,000 Japanese soldiers learned that lesson the hardest way possible. In the jungle, in the dark. One slow, agonizing day at a time.